So today we're going to dive into a couple topics. We're going to start here with determining how species are related, how scientists come up to a conclusion of a species, and who it's more closely related to. Remember that the goal is to realistically identify a modern species, something that exists today that's been found. And to do that, scientists want to use both the morphology similarities among those organisms, as well as whatever hypothesis they have about their evolutionary history or the phylogenetic species concept. Remember, we can't really say where something has come from. We can only sort of assume unless we're using DNA. The more history that organisms share between each other, it means they're more closely related. That sort of just makes sense. So we say they have a fairly common ancestor. Evidence of relationships among species. So here's an example of the great panda. For 100 years, scientists debated whether this panda was more closely related to raccoons, or the red panda, or more closely related to bears. Modern taxonomy uses three main types of evidence to determine these things. We look at anatomy, so the anatomical stuff for that organism. Its physiology, sort of how it moves and functions, or physiological, and the DNA. Anatomical evidence of relationships. So anatomical means your bones, your structure. It's the study of organisms and their structures. Living species can provide anatomical evidence of relationships, but so can species past. We can look at the bone structures of other things. It's interesting because something seemingly so different as a whale, a bat, a horse, and a human, they all have similar bone structures, but they've all adapted over time for things such as swimming, flying, running, and grasping. Recently, and interestingly, they've discovered that dinosaurs, which we once thought were more closely related to reptiles, are actually more closely related to birds. They have hollow spaces in their bones, and they've even noticed recently that there's articulation points in their bones for spots where a wing or something to use for flying was used. Physiological evidence of relationships. So physiology is the study of the physical and chemical functions of organisms, including their internal process. So how is it that they function? How do they use their brain, their muscles, their organs, their tissues? How do we figure this stuff out? Well, we can compare proteins among different species to see the degree of genetic similarity and differences. We can do genetic research to determine whether things like a guinea pig or other rodents should be in different categories. It actually turns out that a guinea pig is. Their insulin, the protein, was shown to be very different from each other. So guinea pigs were actually reclassified. And we can do that. We can look further into species and put them in a different branch or a different part of the phylogenetic tree. DNA evidence of relationships. This is more recent in the past 10-15 years as this becomes more available and more affordable for scientists. Analyzed among species is used to further understand the evolutionary history. We discussed the other day that that's not something you can easily do. I cannot look at a dog and see how closely it's related to a cat. I can only assume or guess. Example of DNA evidence suggests that fungi are more similar to animals than they actually are plants. So things like mushrooms are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. We organize all this information into what's called a phylogenetic tree. The tree is a branching diagram used to show evolutionary relationships among species. We talked about this the other day and how we said nothing is really above the other because the branching of a tree is so variable. But here we can see, like a tree, the base represents the oldest species. The uppermost ends are present-day species, and the forks of the branches are where the points where a species split or evolved. This phylogenetic tree shows an example of species that we commonly know. Impala, maybe not an oryx, but a red deer and a reindeer. They all belong to the same order of Artiodacta, but they split in families. Bovidae on the left are animals that have horns, whereas Cervidae on the right are animals that have antlers. And then they split further. There are importances to classification in technology, society, and environment. They can assist with things like discovering new drugs, hormones, and other medical products. Knowing how a bacteria, for example, or maybe a virus, COVID-19, responds to different drugs or what it's made out of can help us to determine what we need as an antibody or treatments moving forward. Tracing the transmissions of diseases and the development of testing and possible treatments. We can see maybe where one virus evolved from another virus. We constantly talk about animals that we see as an example, but viruses and bacteria are also things that need to be classified. The information can help with increasing crop yields and disease resistance. We can learn what plants survive wind and rain more than others, and then we can cross them into a seed and sort of make a seed that can sustain outside better than the original. And we can use it to actually promote conservation efforts with environmental conservation of organisms and looking at how is it that they survive better in certain areas, what do they need to eat for their physiology, and how to be their strongest, better surviving selves. We're going to take a second here and transition into the next topic, but I want you to recall the other day that we talked about the ordering of organisms. So if I'm sort of, as we said, holding something brand new in my hand and I'm not sure what it's called, well, I need to discover it, so which I've done. I need to give it a name, I need to describe it, and ultimately classify it into those taxonomic categories. You don't need to write this down, please note that. You also don't need to write this down. But I want you to remember that it is broken into those 8 categories: the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We're going to take a look at how we sort things into their domain and their kingdoms. So section 1.3 is kingdoms and domains. When we're classifying species, scientists look into similarities and differences between those organisms at the highest taxons or ranks. So we said again, I'm just going to scroll back, that this order isn't haphazard, it matters. So domain being sort of the most broad or the least specific, moving down towards species, which was more specific. So we're going to look at just classifying within the domain and kingdom. And when scientists look at these similarities, they look closely at the organism's cell type, the number of cells they have, and their DNA sequence. So we're looking at the really nitty-gritty of an organism. The 6 kingdoms are broken down into animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, and archaea. The first step is sort of to look at the 2 major cell types. So this is where we focus our attention as we start. Proteotic cells, or prokaryotes, came before a nucleus. So they're really small, very simple. They don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. They may have some kind of version of a nucleus, but it's not like what we know today. But they are very abundant today, and they are sort of the ancestry type of a cell. It's very basic. As time went on, eukaryotes came to form, or the eukaryotic cell, which has a very true nucleus. When you look at it, you can see that there is a center core. It is bound by a membrane. It stays together inside the cell. This cell is approximately 1,000 times larger, and it is far more complex than its prokaryotic friends. There are 3 domains that we can break into. We can look at bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So eukarya kind of branches off a little bit, and it has protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Traditionally, the eukaryotic kingdom was just sort of all of that piled into one, and then it got sorted out a little bit. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're just sort of trying to sort stuff out. So how do we figure out where a species fits? Well, we use these things called dichotomous keys. And they're an identification tool. So again, if I'm holding something new in my hand, how do I go about identifying this? So what you do is you use a key, which is a series of two-part choices, kind of like yes and no, that lead the user to the correct information of the organism. It's used by scientists when we're holding that unknown species in our hands. And to classify an organism, we begin at the domain level and work through and hopefully get to a point where we can get to a genus or a species level, that very specific. Most questions involve things like its anatomical and structural analysis. We discussed that a bit when we talked about the classifying species concepts and how it's easy to use anatomy and morphology, because I can just look at you and say that you are tall, small, 4 limbs, maybe you walk on 2, walk on 4. Those are things to easily describe with my eyes without having to get into research about how you maybe biologically mate or what your DNA is made up of. In some cases, only the kingdom is required. So maybe we don't want to go so far, but we do just want to figure out sort of where it fits in the kingdom. Maybe we don't need to go as far as the species. You don't have to copy this down. This is just an example of a dichotomous key. Looking at like question 1A. If the skin is dry and watery, you should note that we are talking about the frogs and toads of specifically Algonquin Park. That is how specific the keys get. But if the skin is dry and watery, or the skin is dry and warty, it's the American toad. 1B, the second part of the question, if the skin is not dry and watery, then go to question 2. And so forth, and so forth, and so on, and so on. There are a few main characteristics of a kingdom that we should look at. We just talked about the cell type, so whether it's a prokaryotic cell or eukaryotic cell. They also move on forward, so if I have 2 things that are eukaryotic cell, then maybe I need to go on to look at the cell wall. So animals do not have cell walls. Our cells are kind of, think of it as like blobby. They're mobile. They don't really have a fixed structure. Whereas other organisms like plants have a very fixed structure, and the composition of that wall can vary from plant to plant. Nutrition can be split into autotroph, somebody who makes their own food, or something that makes their own food. A plant, for example, makes their own food through the use of sunlight. Or a heterotroph, something that consumes other organisms. Us, for example, we are heterotrophs. We need other things to consume. We can't use sunlight to make our own food. And then lastly, they look at sexual reproduction. DNA from 2 parents combine to form offspring. Only occur in that eukarya domain. They are the only ones who sexually reproduce. So I'm going to go back a little bit into that domain slide. And so it's only actually fungi, plant, and animalia who sexually reproduce. They take genes from a mom and a dad or 2 parents and combine to form a new offspring. All others reproduce asexually. That's pretty much it. Remember that you're only copying the notes. I guess I should have said that in the beginning, that are on the slide. You don't have to write down everything I'm saying. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.